Train the muscles, not the joints.
Welcome back to Natural Gallant Bodybuilding Mountain. And today I'm going to answer a question that was in my comment section about a week ago. A guy asked me specifically about strategic range of motion and if I could describe it a little bit more in depth for him to understand. So a huge confusing thing on this bodybuilding exercise journey that people have is the full range of motion at any cost sort of scenario, where basically they get taught what the proper range of motion is and what the proper form is for a given exercise, not understanding or realizing that every single exercise is made up by somebody. It's not like they were prescribed commandments in some sort of holy scripture of bodybuilding that came from a divine source of some sort. You know what I'm saying? They were just made up by guys that said, hey, I think I feel this in this area and I feel this in this area, and here you go. Here's the exercises for that. Now, of course, there have been studies and certain exercise physiologists that have studied about what exercises do what, and there are greater majorities of certain muscles involved in certain movements than others. You know what I'm saying? Like squats, we know, are mostly for legs, although there's a lot of lower back in there depending on how much you bend over or not, and so forth. But the big hole in all of this is the law of individuality. That's the biggest missing link that is not talked about enough in bodybuilding and in natural bodybuilding. And that's what I've talked about a lot, just because when I started to come onto the YouTube scene with a great resume of competitive wins and that sort of thing, I've competed all over the world and I competed at a very high level. And when I started my YouTube channel, I started talking to people about how I train and why I train a certain way. I noticed this massive backlash. There was this cries of heresy. You know, you're a heretic. You're saying everything wrong because you're not doing what I was taught on Google, right? So what I realized was that people were not understanding the whys certain exercises are what they are and how to change them depending on what is happening in their given body at the time, right? So I always say you break your own rules, because sometimes your body seems to respond differently depending on what stage it's at. Sometimes full range is best, sometimes partial range is best. And only through really paying attention can you start to find out. And what I mean by paying attention is feeling where the forces are taking place. So for instance, when I squat, because of the way I'm built, in order to stay standing up, I have to bend over quite a bit because I have long femurs and shorter lower back and so forth. And what happens is that because I bend over a lot, once I lower the weight to a certain point, I start to get the butt wink, which is the rounding of the lower back, which you don't want. And that doesn't matter how much stretching of hamstrings and adductors I've done, it doesn't change, right? And if I do a super wide stance, I can go down a little bit lower, but then that changes where the forces play out. So again, what I'm going to say is that any minor adjustment you make to an exercise, even though it's still classified as the same exercise, will change where those forces play out. So if this is a phenomenon that we know happens, we also can take into account that range of motion can also play a factor in what muscles are dominant in the movement of the weight. So as a rule of thumb, what I usually do is decide what muscle group I'm really hitting. You know, so say I'm doing bench presses for chest, or say I'm doing squats for legs. I'll grab onto that bar, right? And I'll lower the weight and I'll feel the tension on that muscle that I want to hit, mostly, right? And I may feel it in other areas as well, but dominantly I'm feeling it in the area that I want to hit. And then once I start to feel the majority of the force start to transfer to another area and basically give that main muscle group I want to hit a break, then I start lifting the weight again. I start concentrically lifting the weight instead of going lower and just bouncing off the tendons. Now, sometimes you may see me go lower, but there's other reasons for that. And that might be because I want to get a stretch in the muscle and in the other muscles as well that are part of the exercise. And then at the same time, I'm probably using a much lighter weight to offset the risk of doing so at the same time, you see? So when you're using super heavy weights, it is better to be a bit more conservative with your range of motion, because that is where you're going to be at the highest risk of tearing or pulling something or tweaking the joints. So it's the same thing with locking out. One guy got on here and said, oh, locking out's not a problem. I'm 7 years old. I've been locking out my whole life. Well, that guy obviously hasn't seen some of the lockout videos on YouTube. There was that one girl on YouTube that was leg pressing, and then she locked her knees at the top to give her legs a rest. And then what happened? They bent backwards. So she tore her knees to crap just because she locked on the joints and turned off the muscular tension that was protecting the joints at the time. She basically relaxed the muscles. Now, when you relax the muscles in a lockout position, all the joints are now taking the stress, not necessarily the muscles, and the muscles are designed to protect the joints, right? It's just like jiu-jitsu. You know, people understand that. When you snap an arm, they understand that in jiu-jitsu, but they don't understand that that can also happen with weights, with the right angle and amount of tension happening, right? So depending on the angles, of course, right? So this is also something you have to take into account when it comes to range of motion. You know, you want to keep the tension on the muscles because the tensions protect the joints, right? The tension keeps the joint compact and controlled in the joint. If you're relaxing the muscles and then having somebody hyperextend your arm, well, obviously your arm will have a greater ability to hyperextend if there's no bicep fighting the process, or no tricep trying to basically hold the elbow together, right? You want both those areas tight so that way the elbow keeps its integrity when somebody does try to hyperextend your elbow. So it's the same thing with exercises. Now, where the confusion really happens is that different people will realize that different ranges of motion work for them, or different exercises altogether work for them, and they'll look at other people and say, well, why is that happening differently with that person? Because they don't understand all the variables at work that contribute to what a person needs to do.
This is not a protein shake, it's coffee. Yeah, let's do protein shake. Raw eggs, man, raw eggs.
Case in point with squatting, it's easy to understand that when people's joint ratio dimensions are different, that when they squat, they will look totally different than another person. Some people squat like Tom Platz, where they can stay almost straight up and down. They can get awesome quad development, and their knees are traveling right over the toes, and they get a big ass, right? And quadriceps mostly, right? And then another person will squat, they bend over a lot, and then they'll tend to get a lot of hamstring development, but they might not be able to go down quite as low. They'll get a little bit more of a quad sweep, but not necessarily as much of a medialis, which is the quadricep close to the knee. And that is also the right thing for them because, again, they're squatting in the way that is biomechanically correct for them. So you have to be really careful when it comes down to comparing what you're doing to somebody else. So that's why the science of experience has to come into the picture. You have to, and I know some people are like, oh, that's just anecdotal, it doesn't mean anything. I'm going to say right now, if I hit you in the head with a sledgehammer and you see stars, that is valid information for you to take into account the next time you see somebody with a sledgehammer. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, I got lucky there.
You have to realize that your sensations are telling you something. And once you learn how to interpret those physical sensations, you'll start to be able to design your own ranges of motion based on what's happening in your body. And sometimes, like I said, sometimes a fuller range is needed in order to stretch out an area, in order to get an area working properly. And in other times, shorter or smaller ranges of motion are necessary in order to isolate the muscle group you want to hit. So that's really what I mean by strategic range of motion. So like say I'm doing a lat pull down and I'm raising the weight up. Well, I notice that once I lock, now I'm starting to get more tension inside the armpit. I've started to cause stress to the labrum, which is offset also exponentially by my own personal situation, which is a labral tear. So the last thing I want to do is put extra mileage on the joint when it's unnecessary. So I keep the elbows bent, keep the elbow in a little bit, and keep that stress on the lat, and then pull down to where I feel the lats. Once I feel I have to rotate in, now I'm bringing in the rotator cuff, which is a much smaller muscle. Also, I get irritation in the shoulder joint from that, and that means I'm going too low. So I want to keep that tension on the lats, and that's exactly why I do the lat pull down. So this is an example of how I will change the range of motion in lat pull downs in order to make sure I'm keeping the stress on the lats and making it as intense as possible on that area, so that way I cause it to grow. So yeah, that's all I got to say about that. I just wanted to explain to anybody that doesn't understand what I'm saying or why I'm saying it. That's really what strategic range of motion is, and you'll see a lot of top bodybuilding pros, natural or otherwise, applying this, whether they know it or not, because sometimes they're not even aware of it. Mountain. So I hope this helps out in your training. Thanks a lot for watching. If you need to get hold of me, just go to naturalgallantbodybuilding.com, and thanks to the Patreon supporters, where I'm doing a podcast every week on bodybuilding stuff. If you're interested in listening to that, just go over to Patreon. It only costs you $5 a month to listen to this stuff. So hey, I don't know why you wouldn't do it. I don't know. I mean, chances are you probably haven't bought an exercise stick either, or a rock. They're so cheap. But anyway, I'll see you in the next video. I'm going to upload a lot more stuff, and yeah, stay tuned. Natural Gallant.